The development of affordable housing is pretty much a myth in the United States. Unless, of course, you developed a robust list of relationships with governments, city planning commissions, neighborhoods, politicians, and etc. Well, lucky for you, our guest has done exactly that. In fact, that is what he spends a ton of his time doing and curating, because he does operate in the world of affordable development, something that we've only talked about once before on this program and is not very frequently talked about because it's very, very challenging to build a business around it in today's regulatory environment, especially when prices are high. So in this discussion, we're going to do a deep dive into the world of affordable development. We're going to talk about how the affordable tax credit system works, how our guest can end up owning $40 million properties with less than $1 million invested. Completely mind-blowing. We're going to talk about some of the main underwriting assumptions our guest looks at when analyzing a potential development. And of course, how our guest creates meaningful, lasting relationships with government agencies so that he can be allowed to operate in the real estate sector in this manner. Now, on our last episode, I did mention this, but it's very, very important that you act now because time is almost run out. If you want access to every single one of our video sessions from our annual real estate conference, which is the Intelligent Investors Real Estate Conference, we have uploaded all 30 plus hours to a website, which is behind a password protection device, and we have made it free until April. What this means is that if you create an account on the website I'm about to tell you, before April, you get access for life. If you wait until after April, you'll have to pay a pretty premium. Now, the URL is intelligentinvestorsrec.com. Go over there, create an account. It requires a password. Once you create an account, you'll have access for life. And this access comes with videos of people like Jeremy Roll, Neil Bawa, Ryan Smith, Bruce Norris, me, to name a few. Awesome content, some incredible, incredible panels that are really going to be interesting to watch now that we're living in a post-COVID-19 world. So head over there to intelligentinvestorsrec.com, create an account, and hope you enjoy all that awesome content. All right, hope you enjoy the episode. How's it going, everyone? Today we are joined by Evan Holladay, who is a real estate developer and investor with over $225 million of multifamily real estate. He's the founder and CEO of Holladay Ventures, where his team specializes in creating and investing in workforce, affordable, and mixed income communities. Evan is also the host of a top 200 business and real estate podcast, Monumental, where he sits down with top industry leaders and entrepreneurs who are making massive changes in the world. Evan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yes, Hunter, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure to link to Monumental in the show notes page. It's definitely the kind of podcast that has presented a lot of value to your listeners. But for those that aren't familiar with your show or aren't familiar with you, tell us a bit about your background and how you segued into real estate and then this particular niche, what I'm very excited about talking about today with you.
Yes, likewise. And a quick aside for everybody listening, Hunter and I are actually having Hunter on Monumental tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that episode. So a little bit about myself and Monumental, really kind of my journey, I like to say, started in college. I was going the pre-med route and, I was very gung-ho about it. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait a second, I don't like science. I don't like chemistry. What am I doing? Like, why am I going down this path? And it started to question everything. And that's when I saw this big multifamily. It was really a student housing with retail development. It was like $55 million. I think it was 380 beds. And I was like, man, like it was announced at the school I went to. And I was like, that's what I need to be doing. Like that gets me excited. I get pumped up. It got me going. And I was like, I'm not even doing it. And I'm getting excited about it. So I ended up telling one of my mentors at the time, I was like, that's really cool what they're doing. He's like, really? He's like, I could introduce you to the owner. I was like, no way. And really that connection, that just chance conversation, chance introduction led me down the path to where I am today. And so I'm very grateful. I tell my mentor, I just had coffee with him a couple months ago. I was like, do you realize like how you helped me on this trajectory of where I am today? But it went back to that initial meeting that owner. And I basically helped bring a bunch of people to his groundbreaking. And he's like, all right, he's like, we'll have you on the team. And so I was the first one he hired at that development.
Oh, wow.
And it was perfect timing because he literally just broke ground. So he had nothing. It was basically like they were digging the foundation at the time. So I got to learn literally soup to nuts of that development. I got to help with like coordinating with all the 13 different retailers and coordinating their leases and, leasing up 380 bed property and managing that process. And also learning very quickly, I did not want to be in property management. I was like, I want to be doing what that guy's doing, the owner. And so that just set me on this like path of, one thing after the other, kind of leading myself down this journey of like, being constantly curious. I was like, you know what? Like, what could I do outside of this and still in real estate? And so as part of a class, we were supposed to start a company. It was really just supposed to be for a class. But myself and 4 others, we decided to create a modular development company where we actually created, segments of a building and modular components in a factory off-site, and then would ship it to the construction site and basically assemble it like Legos. And it would be a lot more efficient, a lot more quicker to market. And then we decided, we're like, well, let's not just be more efficient on the construction side. Let's actually provide housing for people that really deserve housing, quality housing, but don't have the opportunities that most families do. And so we looked at how we could use housing as a tool for economic mobility and social mobility. And so we started working in like public-private partnerships. We were doing tax credits, different things to basically provide workforce housing options and actually build it brand new, but build it at an attainable, affordable price point so working class families could actually afford it. So that, opened up an even wider array of, I was like, all right, well, now I found my niche within what I love. It's that combination, that kind of overlap of real estate and doing good with what we're building, the communities we're actually making happen. So from there, the modular company, we were trying to find development partners. And from there, it's just, another kind of just trying to put myself in the right circles, and ended up meeting this group on a golf course of all places. And one thing leads to another. And they're like, well, how about you come work with us and learn the ropes and do all this with us? And so I was, 22 years old at the time, and got the opportunity of a lifetime to basically learn from guys that had over 100 years of real estate experience. And so they kind of just threw me in the deep end. They're like, hey, go source deals, go put together stuff, go make it happen, learn as you go. And, you sink or swim on your own. And so I really just kind of took that as an opportunity to learn the business, learn affordable housing, learn development, learn tax credits, learn what cities need and how important affordable housing is to like kind of the backbone of the workforce that provides the economies that we all enjoy on a day-to-day basis. And so now today, 7 years later, we've now created over 1,300 workforce affordable housing units. And now I've broken off and started my own development company called Holladay Ventures. And we're doing that exact same thing, but taking that to scale and really also adding in the component of empowering our residents through education and mindset and, podcasts. Like exactly what you do, Hunter, is like you're helping people unlock value and education from others and others' experiences. Like that's what we want to do with our residents, because we see a lot of value in helping them succeed in life. And so that's really become our mission at Holladay Ventures. And then, of course, Monumental, we interview people like yourselves that are making massive change in the world and sharing their stories. And it's been a blessing ever since.
Yeah, I love that. There's so much in there that you mentioned. The first of which is just having that initiative, seeing that opportunity with that development that you felt inclined towards, and then inspiring a mentor by taking that action, creating that momentum and bringing people to the opening ceremony. And that is just so powerful because those opportunities are everywhere. It's just a matter of identifying them and taking action. And that totally changed your trajectory. So if you're listening to this right now, open your eyes to those types of opportunities, because those are the kind of things early in your career can really make or break your next 5, 10, 20 years. And that itself is really powerful. Now, there's probably a lot of people thinking, wow, I didn't know you could develop affordable housing. I didn't know the economics make sense. There must be something that I'm not understanding, which is really what I'm excited about talking to our investors about. In fact, we started talking, we were at Best Ever Conference and we're in line for the buffet, and you started explaining your model, which I am somewhat familiar with because I have a friend that works in the business in a similar space. And once we started diving into the numbers, I was like, okay, we have to have you on the show to talk about this. So let's talk about, number one, big picture, your investing strategy, which obviously is affordable and workforce development. But more importantly, the X factor that most people may not be familiar with, how you actually go about doing this, because it's not as straightforward as identifying a piece of land and taking something ground up, as most developments are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we could probably create a master class on maybe 20 podcast episodes, but to boil it down, it's really more or less we're providing something that the market really cannot provide on its own. And that is new construction, quality construction, and really sometimes quality rehab work, and offering that at a price point that is technically below market for that new construction style. But we're still having our residents pay rent. They're just paying a rent at what is more attainable for a working class income. So we're serving families making household income from 30 to 70,000. And so usually families at that price point can't afford something brand new, can't afford something that, is something that they can really be proud of. It's typically going to be an older property, maybe a Class C property on the edge of town where they may not get the same educational opportunities. They may not be in as nice of a neighborhood. They may not be an hour away from where they work. So this program basically says, okay, well, there's a disconnect in the market where vast majority of new construction right now is all for Class A. That may change, but the last 5-10 years, it's all been Class A properties. And so the government since 1986 basically made this tax credit program where they're saying, hey, the government will give a tax credit, and they basically allocate those to state agencies. And the state agencies are then basically the controllers of which projects get funded. And so as long as you match their guidelines, you apply for credits, you get credits for your project, you can typically get credits for about 40% of your project. There's two different types of credits, but the ones we use, we can get 40% of our costs covered with credits. So what that means is we will actually get awarded the credits, the project will, and then we'll turn around and sell those credits to investors, which are typically institutional, typically banks that need to be investing in neighborhoods where they historically have avoided, the whole redlining from many decades ago. This part of the Community Reinvestment Act of 1986 says that banks actually are required to invest in lower income neighborhoods and not avoid them like they had previously. So requiring them to buy these credits is part of that. So they buy the credits. So we get cash in lieu of giving them the credits. And that basically helps cover about 40% of our costs. So that way we can build something with 40% of our costs covered. And then we cover 50% of it with a loan, same as any other multifamily property. And then the last 5 to 10% is typically covered by, we'll defer part of our fees, or we'll put in our own equity, or we will get a grant or a loan from the local government or the state government. So it's basically a way to basically provide housing, at a price point from $800 to $1,200 a month that would normally, brand new quality, would go for, $1,500 to $2,000 a month. So it's a way for us to give a discounted price for something that may be in a better location, better quality community, something that they can really be proud of and can hopefully give them the leg up that they need and the stability they need to really grow and move up the economic ladder.
Yeah, and so we're talking about the percentage basis. So walk us through a deal, let's say, in terms of the number of anticipated units, and then also the gross dollars amount that would be involved, and then also the equity amount, given that you're having 40% covered by a loan, 50% covered by a tax credit program. So that doesn't leave much in terms of the actual equity that is required. So walk us through what those numbers actually look like.
Yeah, so the tax credits are typically, that is your majority of your equity once you sell those to your institutional investor. So that's going to be roughly 40%. So, on a $40 million deal, that'll be about 12 to 15 million. And they don't typically give you dollar for dollar. There's some negotiated agreement where basically they're saying, well, I'm going to write off $1 on my taxes, but I'm going to give you 92 cents in cash equity.
Right.
Because they obviously need to get some sort of return. So they're basically giving us 92 cents on the dollar, some arrangement. Mm-hmm. So that'll cover roughly 40%. And then the loan, it's typically, you can do 80%, 80 to 90% even loan to value. But if you think about, because our NOI is hindered by the cap on our rents, basically all of our rents are capped to 30% of what our residents are making. That is what is HUD's definition of basically what everybody should be paying as far as their paycheck. You should be paying 30%, no more than 30% of your annual or your monthly income on your housing. So because of our capped rents, and we agree to cap those in return for getting the credits, because of that, our NOI is much lower than a comparable market rate property. So in turn, our loan actually, 80, 90% loan to value really only comes out to 50, maybe 60% loan to cost. So that loan is what covers the majority of the property. And then the loans or the grants that we get from local governments, those cover, typically in the amount of like 1 to 2, maybe 3 million. And they're basically home funds, CDBG funds, different grants that, are payable out of cash flow. Sometimes they're grants and they just roll it into the deal because you're providing a public service. But typically you have to pay those back over time. But they're very long-term, out of cash flow, like payable whenever you have cash flow, because their goal is to help you finance the deal.
Got it. So let's say on a $40 million property, what would be a typical equity requirement, not including the tax credits, but the true out-of-pocket equity for creating a deal like this?
Yeah, so the main expenses that we have to cover are on the pre-development side. So that's really depends on the project. It depends on if you're buying the land up front, but it's anywhere from $500,000 to $1.5 million to $2 million if you're buying the land. And then that will be taken out by the tax credit equity.
Okay, so that's actually included. Wow, so that's not even long-term. So just to reemphasize this, because this is why this is such a fascinating space, you're talking about creating a $40 million piece of real estate with a $500,000 to $1.5 million investment that will most likely be repaid very quickly during the development stage. And so I guess the question is, there's so many questions, right? But one of them is, so do you take on investors? Like, how does that work? Is this something that, in the syndicated world, we have hundreds of investors. If we're going to have a $40 million property, we're probably going to raise $20 million or something like that,
right.
Or something in that range. And hundreds of investors could be involved. And most of my time would be spent dealing with all those investors. How do you source that? And then also, do you spend your time dealing with investors or dealing with other entities or personnel?
Good. All great questions. The typical partners that we're working with as of now have been family offices or other investors that we've partnered with, and they're basically bringing all the capital for that deal. It's just been easier that way. We are looking at how we can partner with multiple investors throughout these deals to give more investors the opportunity to get involved, because we do think this is a great opportunity to make a great return and make a great impact. That overlap of impact investing, we think there's a lot of potential here, and we want to give that opportunity to more people. So I definitely think, we're constantly thinking about how we can include more people in this process. So I think that will be coming soon. As far as what we're doing now, we typically have one investor per project. And then we have some that have basically agreed to help us with a pipeline of projects. So that's how we've done it to date. But we're wanting to really scale this thing and take it nationwide so we can unlock and tap into the huge need of affordable housing. And, coronavirus is doing nothing but making that problem like extremely worse. So I think we're in a position where the demand for our product is only going to continue to grow, and possibly even the funding could go up significantly from the state and federal level because of coronavirus, this could be like a, rallying cry for affordable housing, and also even getting investors more involved in it. And just people are going to see like, okay, well, housing right now is really the only thing a lot of families have. How can we help give them an attainable, affordable price point for that housing?
Right. So when you're looking at a deal, what are some of the underwriting metrics that you look at to see if the deal is going to pencil? Like, what are some of the top ones where if you see that those numbers line up, it's a really good sign?
Yeah, good question. The biggest thing is, so our rents are dictated. Like I was saying earlier, they're all dictated by HUD, and they change annually based on the area median income for that area, the metro statistical area. So we first look at those, but really there's different underwriting criteria for affordable deals. Banks and lenders and investors are a little bit more just allowing you to push for greater terms because they want to see affordable housing get done. So we're doing, 115 to 120 debt service. The biggest metric that we're looking for is just making sure that the sources and the uses pencil out, because a lot of our investor equity is going to be returned by the time we close. We don't really go after the same return metrics. Like we don't go after IRR. We don't go after cash on cash. The biggest thing that we look for, because the majority of our return is coming from the actual fee we collect on, less so the actual cash flow.
Right.
So we're just making sure that the actual deal pencils out as far as sources and uses, and we're not having a deficit in the amount of uses that we need to put into the deal. So that's really the main thing, is if the sources and uses match up, sources basically being what I was describing earlier, like the tax credits, the loan, our deferred fee, and then any grants or loans. If those pencil out, then we start moving forward. So that's really the biggest metric we look for. We try to spend as little money as possible until we have that secured. And then any sort of funding, like a tax abatement or a pilot or tax credits and bonds or grants or loans, like we try to spend as little money up to that point as possible because our risk is so high, not knowing if we have all the financing lined up.
Okay, got it. And when you're looking at the underwriting, you mentioned that the rents are dictated annually. What percentage of the units would be market rent, or would it all be subsidized housing?
You can do it however you want as the owner operator. And I would just say a caveat: it's not subsidized unless the government is paying for part of the rent, which in that case, we're basically just capping our rent.
Okay.
So the residents pay 100% of the rent.
I see.
But yeah, as far as the unit mix, we typically do 80 to 100% of our units as tax credit units because of the way that the program basically incentivizes you, because you only get credits on the number of affordable units, meaning 60% of area median income or less. So any unit that is serving 60% AMI or less, those get credits. So we typically try to do as much as possible for those units, just because that's where your equity is coming from, is from your tax credits. So the lower amount of units, the percentage of units that you do that are affordable, the lower credits you get, which lowers your equity, which in turn raises the amount of money that you have to put in the deal, which may not economically make sense given that you're going to have lower rents on this property.
Makes sense. So I think that now that we understand that basically you're buying creating a $40 million property, likely going to invest somewhere in the range of $1 million, most likely going to receive that back very quickly. The question probably is, why haven't I been investing like this my whole life? And why are these deals not readily available? How do you have to create them? Like, what is the process by which these come to fruition? Because it's not the way most real estate investors that are in this particular niche don't spend their time doing what other people in other niches typically do. So tell us about your day-to-day and how you create these deals and make them possible.
Yeah. It's funny. Every time I tell somebody about what I do, they're like, kind of the reaction you and I had when we were talking at Best Ever is like, wait a second, what? Like, how does that work? I've never heard of that. And it's just, people are so mind blown by it because it is such a niche, and really, like, it is hard to get into. It is hard to invest in. It's hard to get started doing one of these deals if you want to do it on your own, or even partner with somebody. There's a lot of ambiguity behind it and a lot of gray area, and not enough education out there. And really, that's become like one of my personal kind of missions is, the last couple of months, I'm like, hey, wait a second. The best way, I mean, granted, it could potentially maybe even add more competitors for my business. But at the end of the day, I'm like, we need more affordable housing. And I believe that, rising tide lifts all boats. And, same as what you're doing in the syndication world, I think the more education we get out there, the better we're all going to be for it. And it may, at the end of the day, bring more business to what we're doing at Holladay Ventures, because people like that we're bringing value to them. But as far as on a day-to-day, I mean, I think it's comparable to what any other multifamily group is doing. It's just we're going to be more geared towards like for example, right now we're going through a rezoning.
Exactly.
So I have to deal with that. I have to deal with architects. We're negotiating a contract with an architect right now for a rezoning. We are just had a call with some of our investors. We're trying to figure out like how many deals we should be working on for 2021. We're talking about what we'd be doing about 2022, because these deals take so long to get entitled, to rezone, to get tax credits, bonds, permits. There's just so many moving parts that we typically talk in at least 12-month timeframes for project cycles. So like what we're trying to close by the end of the year, we were already working on 6 months ago. And so it basically like it's working on all of that, is working on architects, engineers, coordinating with the city. We're coordinating with council members, making sure the community's on board, even talking to community leaders. We're talking to the mayor's office. We're trying to get, public-private partnerships approved, pilots approved. We're trying to show the economic benefit for providing this workforce housing and how it has a ripple effect through economies. We're also working with state agencies. We're putting together, they have these like applications for the tax credits that are like 100 to 150 plus pages that we have to put together. So that takes a lot of our time. I mean, there's just so many moving parts. I mean, development itself has a bunch of moving parts, but then you add on the layer of using public money to help pay for part of it, or at least public tax credits to help pay for part of it. And that adds a whole nother layer of complexity. But it's really, I got to say, it's a lot of fun. It's completely different. It's very complex. It's really like makes you think every day. Sometimes it makes you think, why the heck am I doing this? But it's a lot of fun, man. I mean, it's just every day is completely different, and you get to work with all kinds of different people, find yourself in all different types of situations. And at the end of the day, like the best feeling in the world is like when you get on that call, you close, and then 2 weeks later, you see big backhoes that like tires bigger than me, and I'm 6'3", and those big backhoes are moving like, hundreds of thousands of pounds of dirt. And it's just the most rewarding feeling to know you're actually like making something happen out of all that. Like, you push inch a day and you don't see anything. I mean, anything for like 2 years sometimes. And then all of a sudden you see dirt moving, and that's the best feeling in the world. And that's what gets me going.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's funny. I'm glad that you got to that point in that answer, because sometimes we can be focused on our own particular niche, but everything that you outlined, I think you started by saying what's very similar to what other multifamily operators are doing. That is not what I spend my time doing all day. You know what I mean? Like you're really, you're curating relationships with governments, you're interfacing with the tax credit system, you're interfacing with the zoning, for example. Like that's a big part of this value add. Yes, that is typical in most development firms for sure, which is a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but it's even heightened with the complexity regarding those tax credit systems, because, in short, the government is paying, or the citizenry is paying for the development of those projects. And I really like that you tied it up by saying that when you see the dirt moving, it's really that affirmation that all that hard work was worth it, because I'm imagining that interfacing with those governments and tend to be a little bureaucratic in the way that they move very slowly and such, and maybe you can go down a route that ends up not paying any dividends. I can see that happening a lot. Now, other than, let's say, your time, which is obviously very valuable, what are some of the ways that you can get burned? Like, where does this model start to break down? Like, can you go down a certain route and say, oh no, this is really, really challenging. We should exit this deal? Or because there's not a lot of equity at stake, at least not your own equity, how can a major challenge be presented in this business?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot. I mean, there's so many moving parts and so many different partners and so many different capital sources, and really development in general, not just affordable housing, but just development in general. You're putting yourself at risk on the front end. We typically try to spend as little as possible until we know we have a deal. But even if we know we have a deal's not done until everything gets funded, right? So we're still at risk. And so we've had it happen in the past where, a great example is 4 years ago in the election, we had a 204 unit deal. I'd worked on it for 2 years, and I'd lined up all the equity. I'd lined up all the debt. I'd lined up grants, the loans, the tax credits. Everything was lined up on this deal. It was going to be a home run deal for us. And we were 2 weeks away from closing, and the election happened. Trump got elected. A lot of people didn't see it coming. So the interest rate on our loan went up 50 basis points, and the pricing on our tax credits, because everybody anticipated Hillary winning, so taxes were either going to stay the same or go up. While our demand for credits is based on demand for basically tax write-offs, right? So if people anticipated once Trump did get elected, people are like, well, he's possibly going to pass his tax cut bill, which is going to lower our tax write-off need. So in turn, that's going to lower the demand for tax credits. So this huge domino effect that you don't even think about. And then you're like, wait a second. Now all of our investors for credits, what we had previously agreed to, they're like, look, we can't honor that anymore. And so we had just, in the matter of one election, we lost our lender and we lost our equity partner. And basically we had to go out and find new lender, new equity. And it took us a whole nother year to get that deal closed. We ended up having to do a HUD 221D4 in order to get the proceeds we needed. And so, there's always going to be kind of unknowns like that. I think if you have the liquidity or the reserves available to still work on deals throughout the downswings, that's when you're going to find the most value. Like, I think right now what we're going through with coronavirus, like it's definitely going to slow down a little bit, but if we can keep working on the deals we're going through, then as soon as things start to tick back up, then we're ready to pull the trigger on deals instead of having to restart them then. Because these development timelines are so long, we need to always be thinking about, okay, well, the deals we know are going to close, let's keep working on them so that way we'll be prepared. But there's so many unknowns with tax credit pricing, with the global economy. There's also less cash flow in these deals. Right. Because we can do a lower debt service, we're basically getting less cash on an annual basis from the property, which is fine because we're not having to hit a certain IRR for our investors or anything. But that makes it a little bit harder if we hit a rough patch in the economy and our residents can't necessarily pay higher affordability rents. Then we may even have to lower our rents, and then that just turns out our cash flow even tighter. So that, there's things like that play into it. But overall, I think it's a phenomenal model if you can figure it out or partner with somebody that has figured it out.
Yeah, when you started answering that question, I thought you were going to go a different direction because it has to do with elections. So I can see how a national election can change the supply-demand equilibrium in terms of the demand for those tax credits. Well, what about if there's a change at the local government level where governments have accepted that you're going to be developing these projects and have accepted that they're going to give you these tax credits, but then there's a change, especially an unpredicted change in the governments at that municipal level, for example. Can that kill a project as well?
Yeah, actually, that's happened to me a few times where I'm working on projects, and because they have such long time frames, you can typically deal with turnover in city leadership, from the mayor to the council members, even to like non-elected officials, like in planning or, zoning and stuff like that. So that's always something you have to think about, and you just kind of have to roll with it. But yeah, that is a risk. I mean, if you don't have certain things approved, like we've had council members, I was working on a project and this council member loved the project. He's like, yes, we'll definitely get this rezoned for you. And he had a re-election, and everybody had told us, like, no, he's the favorite. He's for sure going to win. Well, he ends up losing. And so we've spent probably $75,000 on this project. And now we're like, well, we don't even know the new councilman. How are we supposed to get it rezoned? Like, what is he going to think? Are we going to have to start all over? So many questions. And we were very fortunate that he had actually attended all those community meetings that we had previously done, and he had been a huge supporter of it. So we were fortunate in that occasion, but you don't always get that fortunate where you get the same sentiment going into the next council. So that is definitely a big unknown. And also some council people or mayors even, they set the direction, and typically they have a lot of authority in like city, county governments. The mayor has a lot of power, and they can literally set the direction and the funding for affordable housing. And not only that, but zoning and the future use, like the future use for the city of the land and where they're going to develop, how they're going to develop, if they're going to support affordable housing. So they have a lot of power. And so, having a turnover in a mayor and city leadership is also can definitely slow you down and may even stop your project.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. So you get the zoning, you get the tax credits, you get the equity in place, you go ground up, you develop the asset. Then what's the plan? Is the plan to hold forever because it's a unique product type that you put years into, or do you anticipate selling the asset and trying to find a new one?
So great question. I think the way we're looking at things is we want to be long-term hold builder developers. So per the tax credits, you need to, at least you agree to hold on to it for 15 years.
Okay.
You can sell it before then. It's just a little bit complicated. But we basically plan on everything we build, we stay in it for 15 years. And at that point, we recapitalize, we refinance the project, we pull out our equity, and then we put on long-term debt. Or we look at some component of, you can even recycle the project through the tax credit program and rehab it, give it any sort of updated needs, and just restart the cycle. So that way we can keep it affordable and make a developer fee or some sort of fee in the process.
Yeah, that's actually very similar to my friend, and we'll talk about him later at the end of the show because I want to make a little note about it. But yeah, so basically just to restate that, many of the terms are 15 years, at which point you can basically redo the project because there's wear and tear that takes place in the project. The whole point of this project is to have an affordable place to live, which is relatively new construction. So municipalities deem that, after 15 years, you can basically apply for the same system and do it again and keep the asset. And so legitimate multi-generational wealth can be created by simply creating these assets, refinancing in perpetuity, and then rehabbing the same assets which are already under ownership. That doesn't require the zoning, that doesn't require the complications that go along with that. Is that a fair summary?
That's exactly right.
Pretty incredible model. So you mentioned Corona a couple times. I want to talk to you about that. What are you seeing in the marketplace right now? Are there deals being done? Are lenders and government agencies still acting at the same rate? Or I guess the agencies themselves, certainly as of today, March 31st, they could certainly be closed down. Where are things looking on your spectrum on that?
Yeah, I would say anything that is close to closing in the affordable world right now is definitely slowed down. I think by at least 60 to 90 days. What we're working on, I think I mentioned earlier, we don't have anything imminently closing, but what we are working on is 8 months out, 16 months out, and that still is getting slowed down because there's certain things we need from the city, from the state housing agency, basically from the government, and they're all either working from home or basically said, like, anything that's not emergency, we're not going to handle right now. So there hasn't been any planning meetings. Basically, they're saying no rezonings, no entitlements pretty much for the next until we can start meeting again publicly.
Mm-hmm.
So not knowing when that is either. I mean, we thought it may be sometime in April, and now it looks like earliest possible is May. And so having that kind of unknown in the air is definitely slowing us down. But, we're trying to basically get everything teed up so that way, as soon as this thing rolls off, we're in a position where we're saying, hey, we're ready to move forward with our rezoning instead of restarting our plans then. We're working with our civils, our architects, trying to basically get all the other things done outside of city-related approvals that we can.
Awesome. I'm going to throw a curveball question. I think you've done a really great question, example of kind of highlighting this business, a very interesting business. In fact, I will say that you mentioned not a lot of people are talking about it. Well, look, there's a reason for that. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is certainly the competition. The other one is that the lack of required equity lends itself to, okay, so you need $500,000. Well, there's a lot of people that have $500,000 and that's it. And that's all you need. So what's the point of going out and saying, hey, we're doing this and it's really successful? And so a lot of people have quietly been succeeding in this business. In fact, when my friend came on the show to talk about it, he didn't say the name of the company he worked for, which is a family office, like most of this business is done. And he didn't leave his name because he was required not to in order to come on the show. Yeah. So I really appreciate you doing that. It definitely speaks to your belief in the mission, which is to provide affordable housing. And in a time when we're literally having a housing crisis all over the United States, especially in major cities. Yeah. So I really appreciate you coming on. It's a really interesting model. It's something we haven't talked a lot about before. And definitely interesting. Now, before I jump off, though, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your show. Most importantly, you've interviewed some massive high flyers, successful entrepreneurs. What is one really amazing takeaway that you got from all those interviews and a guest that you really suggest people look into if they're not already familiar with?
Yeah, great. Both great questions. I honestly, if I had to boil it down, so I think it was about a week ago, we had our 2-year anniversary since our first show of Monumental. And I'd say over the last 2 years of doing this, the biggest thing I learned is there's so much power in just one, taking action, but even, that's a broad statement, but take that one step further on the more granular level. It's like just A, starting a show gives you a platform. And B, once you start that show, the people who you thought were, quote unquote, untouchable in your mind, or like people you never thought you'd talk to or never thought you'd associate with or never thought, you always looked up to them more or less. It's amazing just the power of asking. The worst they can say is say no. But, that's one thing I learned is like, we've been able to get some awesome top level guests who previously have this massive, massive following, millions of followers. And we're like, man, why'd they say yes? It's like they said yes because you ask with intention, and you have a platform to help spread their message and create a connection. So I would say that's been the biggest thing for me is like, I've just learned that you need to ask because you never know what's going to come out of it. And, a lot of time I don't even get responses for the high level people I reach out to, but it's also just a numbers game. So I've learned a lot from that. And then one of the guests, honestly, I love to throw it back to the very first episode. It's a guy named Bob Manasier. He's a venture capitalist from New York. He inspired me to start this. He didn't know it, but he did. But he's like wise beyond many, many decades because he's invested in so many companies and he's seen trends in so many companies.
Yes.
And he knows how to spot leaders of companies and entrepreneurs that are going to make it, are going to be successful. And he basically helps nurture them and give them hands-on support. So I thought that was just fascinating for me. But quick side note, he helped me start the podcast because I met him offhand, like just by chance. He was in Louisville. I was living in Louisville at the time. And I was like, man, I need to keep talking to this guy. Like, I'm in real estate though. Like, that doesn't seem to have too much overlap with venture capital. Like, what can be my excuse to keep talking to him? And so I told him, I was like, hey, I have a podcast where I interview people like you. I'd love to have you on. And he's like, really? He's like, that's great. I'd love to be on. Here's my card. And then I was like, oh shit, I guess I need to figure out like how to do a podcast and all that.
Right.
So over the next month, I basically got it up and running because of him, more or less. And then we were like, hey, let's turn this into a real thing.
That is really incredible, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I like that you were able to get a quality guest on for your first guest, because a lot of shows start with a little bit of lack of momentum and it takes time to build. But similarly, one of my favorite episodes is our first episode. So anyway, I appreciate you sharing that, and I really appreciate you coming on. Added a ton of value. Before we jump off, though, let the listeners know how they can learn more about you, and also your show. We'll link to both in the show notes page as well.
Yeah, and thank you again for having me on. This was pretty awesome to be on your show and talk about our mission and what I love talking about most. So people can connect with me either through our real estate company, which is holladayventures.com, or the podcast, evanholladay.com. And then also I'm very active on Instagram. That's at Evan Holladay.
Cool. Well, I will shoot you a follow. I just got a business Instagram and I am now active as well. So I will shoot you a follow. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, listeners, thanks for checking out the episode. As always, the contact information for our guest will be available in the show notes page, which is hosted on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher. Don't forget, if you want access to some of the free goodies that I'm talking about at the beginning of these episodes, like free ebooks, weekly investor emails, and articles about some of the most important investment-related topics, make sure that you have created an account with CFC, because this stuff is automatically available. You can do this by going to cashflowconnections.com and signing up as an accredited investor. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at hunterthompson@cashflowconnections.com. Thanks again.